Capital in the 21st Century, Chapter 1, Income and Output. Part 1, the question that would not go away. Let us begin with a confession. Most economics textbooks open with a chart, or a definition, or, if the author is feeling particularly bold, a warning about assumptions. Thomas Piketty opened his with a question. And the question was this: are we heading back to a world of inherited wealth? A world where what you are born into matters infinitely more than what you work for. A world that Europe and America thought they had left behind. A world like the 19th century. That is not a cozy question. That is the kind of question that makes central bankers shift in their chairs and politicians change the subject. But Piketty asked it anyway. And he did something unusual for an economist. He went looking for data, real data, messy data. Centuries of tax records, inheritance filings, national accounts, probate documents. The kind of documents that gather dust in archives and smell faintly of old decisions. He built a database spanning more than 20 countries, and in some cases more than 200 years. And what he found was not reassuring. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before we can understand what he found, we need to understand the concepts he is working with. And before we can understand the concepts, we need to understand why they matter. So let us start at the very beginning, which, as someone once said, is a very good place to start. The question of distribution. Here is a fact about economics that economists sometimes prefer not to emphasize. Economics is not primarily a science of growth. It is a science of distribution. Not how much wealth exists, but who has it. These are completely different questions, and for most of modern economic history, we have been much better at answering the first one than the second. We know a great deal about how economies grow. We have built elaborate models, tracked productivity, measured trade flows, counted patents. We have whole government departments devoted to measuring output to the nearest tenth of a percentage point. But who gets the proceeds of that output? That question has been treated for most of the 20th century as somehow less respectable, less scientific, more political. Piketty finds this bizarre, and so do I. Let me give you a vivid illustration of why distribution matters. Imagine a country where the economy grows by 4% every year for a decade. Impressive, 40% bigger in a decade. Politicians are delighted. Newspapers report a golden age. Now imagine that 95% of that growth goes to the top 1% of income earners. The other 99% of people share the remaining 5% of growth. Their incomes, in real terms, barely move. This is not a hypothetical. This is very close to what happened in the United States between roughly 1980 and 2008. The economy grew, by a lot, and most Americans felt it barely, because they were not receiving their proportionate share. Now, is that an economics problem, or a politics problem, or a moral problem? The answer is all three, and Piketty insists we stop pretending these categories do not overlap. The 19th century and its discontents. Before we dig into Piketty's framework, let us set the historical scene. Because the world he is worried we are returning to is the world his grandparents and great-grandparents lived in. The 19th century in Western Europe was a world of extraordinary, almost cartoonish inequality. Not the polite inequality of today where the rich have nicer cars. The structural inequality of a world where a small number of families owned almost everything and the rest owned almost nothing. In France in 1910, the top 10% of wealth holders owned around 90% of all wealth. The top 1% alone owned more than 60%. Think about what that means in human terms. You could walk through a French village of 1,000 people, and the entire land, most of the houses, the mill, the forge, the vineyards, perhaps even the church pews, all of it would be owned by about 10 of those 1,000 people, probably fewer. The other 990, they rented, they worked, they saved cautiously, they inherited, if they were lucky, a few sticks of furniture and a debt or two. Britain was similar. The great aristocratic families of England held concentrations of land that had been accumulating since the Norman conquest, and those families were still very much in charge. Now here is what is so culturally interesting about that world. It did not necessarily feel like an outrage to the people living in it. It felt normal. It felt like the natural order of things. Literature reflected this. The entire plot engine of a Jane Austen novel is the question of inheritance. Who will inherit Pemberley? Who has 10,000 a year? Who is making the terrible mistake of marrying for love rather than security? These are not romantic digressions. They are economic realities. In that world, what you married into mattered more than what you earned, because the returns on inherited capital were high, reliable, and generationally durable. Wages were fine, but capital was the game. And Piketty's central argument, in one uncomfortable sentence, is this: we may be returning to that world. Enter the 20th century and its convenient disruptions. So why did we ever think we had escaped it? Because the 20th century happened, and it was, from the perspective of capital, an absolute catastrophe. 2 world wars, the Great Depression, massive state expansion, nationalization, tax rates on top incomes that, in the United States and Britain, reached 90% and above, literal physical destruction of capital stock across Europe, the liquidation of entire imperial wealth systems as colonies gained independence. The result was a dramatic compression of inequality. In France, in Britain, in Germany, in the United States, the gap between the rich and everyone else narrowed substantially between roughly 1910 and 1970. This was the era of the Great Compression, as economists call it. And many people, looking at this period, concluded that inequality naturally falls as economies modernize, that this was progress, that we had moved beyond the brutal logic of the 19th century. The great American economist Simon Kuznets gave this idea theoretical respectability in the 1950s. His famous curve, the so-called Kuznets curve, suggested that inequality first rises as economies industrialize, then falls as they mature and prosperity spreads. A reassuring story: markets fix themselves, growth helps everyone, patience is a virtue. Piketty has, to put it gently, problems with this story. The problem with optimism. Kuznets was not wrong about the data he had. The data did show declining inequality in the mid-20th century, but Piketty argues he misread the cause. The Great Compression was not the automatic result of economic maturity. It was the result of specific, catastrophic, unrepeatable shocks. Wars, depressions, deliberate political interventions. Remove those shocks and the underlying dynamics of capitalism reassert themselves. And those dynamics, left to run undisturbed, tend to concentrate wealth rather than distribute it. This is the core of Piketty's intellectual provocation. The 20th century was the exception. The 19th century, and perhaps the 21st, is the rule. He reaches this conclusion through an analysis of what he calls the fundamental laws of capitalism, which we will get to in a moment. But first, I want to make sure we are all working with the same vocabulary, because Piketty uses his terms with great precision, and the terms matter. The building blocks: output, capital, and income. What is output? In Piketty's framework, output means the total value of all goods and services produced in an economy in a given year. It is what most people call GDP, or gross domestic product, or, in national accounts language, national income. Now, national income is not quite the same as GDP. National income strips out the portion of production that goes merely to replace worn-out capital, what economists call depreciation, and it adds income received from abroad, minus income paid to foreigners. But for our purposes today, think of output as the total cake that an economy bakes in a year. What is capital? This is where it gets interesting. Piketty uses capital and wealth interchangeably, which some economists find controversial. For him, capital is the total stock of non-human assets owned by individuals and governments in a country. Land, buildings, machines, financial assets, intellectual property. It is the accumulation of past production that has been saved rather than consumed. Think of it this way. Output is the river. Capital is the lake that forms when some of that river is dammed rather than allowed to flow on through. Every year some of what is produced gets consumed. Food is eaten, services are used, but some gets SAVAD, invested in a factory, deposited in a bank, used to buy a building. That saved portion becomes capital. And capital crucially generates a return. It earns income for its owners, rent if it is land or property, dividends if it is shares, interest if it is bonds, profit if it is a business. So we have two types of income in any economy. First, labor income, what you earn from work, wages, salaries, bonuses, the income from your own professional activity. Second, capital income, what you earn from owning things, rent, dividends, interest, profits. And here is the fundamental question of distribution. What share of total output goes to labor, and what share goes to capital? This split, the capital-labor split, is the central variable in Piketty's entire framework, and it has enormous consequences for inequality, because capital is far more unequally distributed than labor. Why capital is more unequal than you think? Let me put some flesh on this. Wage inequality is real. A CEO earns more than a cleaner. A surgeon earns more than a nurse. A star footballer earns more than a substitute. But there is a floor to wage inequality. Nobody earns zero wages or minus wages, and the distribution, while skewed, has limits. The highest paid employee in a country might earn, say, 1,000 times the median wage. Extraordinary, but bounded. Capital inequality is a different creature altogether. Because capital compounds. It earns a return, and that return gets reinvested, and that earns a return, and so on, generation after generation. And capital can be inherited, so the person who holds the capital does not even need to have produced it. They simply need to have had the good sense to be born to the right parents. Let me give you a historical example that is almost too perfect. In 1815, after the defeat of Napoleon, the British government owed an enormous debt. It had been borrowing for decades to fund the wars. The national debt was roughly 200% of national income. The government needed to pay interest on this debt, and who held the debt? Wealthy individuals, the landed gentry, the merchant class, the financiers of the City of London. So for the next century, a substantial portion of British government revenue, collected from everyone through taxation, flowed upward to the small class of people who had lent the government money, year after year after year. This is capital at work, passively, reliably, regardless of whether its owners do anything useful whatsoever. And this is why the capital-labor split matters so much. A world where capital earns a larger share is, almost by definition, a more unequal world, because capital is owned by the few, labor is performed by the many. A brief encounter with
Balzac.
Piketty famously uses literature as a lens in this book, and his favorite literary witness is
Honoré de Balzac.
the great 19th-century French novelist. Balzac wrote about money with a frankness that the English-speaking tradition, with its Victorian squeamishness about discussing finance, generally avoided. His characters think about money constantly. They calculate. There is a scene Piketty returns to repeatedly from the novel.
Le Père Goriot.
A young man named Rastignac has come to Paris to make his fortune through hard work and talent. He meets an older, cynical man named Vautrin, who sits him down and delivers a lecture in cold mathematics. Vautrin says essentially, young man, forget the law, forget medicine, forget your noble ambitions. The very best you can achieve through 20 years of grinding toil might bring you perhaps 6,000 francs a year. But if you marry a woman with 1,000,000 francs in capital at 5% return, you get 50,000 francs a year, immediately, without lifting a finger. So either you marry money, Vautrin says, or you live and die in mediocrity. This is not a villain's speech. This is an accurate description of the mathematics of the 19th century. The return on capital genuinely was higher than you could earn through labor, even talented, educated, professional labor. And Piketty argues that this Balzacian world is not as dead as we assumed. He would know. He grew up in France, studied in Paris and at MIT, and watched with his own eyes as the fortunes accumulated in the 19th century began to reassert themselves in the late 20th. The numbers behind the story. Let me give you some concrete numbers, because Piketty is always about the data. In France in 1800, the total stock of private wealth was roughly 7 times national income. Every year, the economy produced a certain amount, and private individuals collectively owned about 7 years' worth of that production in the form of accumulated assets. By 1950, after 2 wars, a depression, and enormous state intervention, that ratio had collapsed to roughly 2 to 1. The wars had destroyed capital. Inflation had eroded financial wealth. Nationalization had transferred private assets to the state. Progressive taxation had slowed the accumulation of new fortunes. But then the process reversed. By 2010, the ratio was back up to 5 to 6 times national income, and rising. This is Piketty's central empirical finding, illustrated with beautiful, devastating simplicity. The ratio of private wealth to national income traces a U-shape over the 20th century, a fall caused by exceptional shocks, a recovery driven by the normal workings of capitalism. And if the trend continues, the ratio in France, in Britain, in much of Europe, will return to the Belle Epoque levels of 1900 to 1910, somewhere around 2050 to 2060. The world of Balzac and Austen, made new. Let us check in with the present moment. Now, you might be thinking, this is all very interesting historically, but what does it have to do with the world as it exists right now? A great deal. Consider, as of the early 2020s, Elon Musk at various points held wealth equivalent to the annual income of entire nations. Jeff Bezos, at his peak, was adding more to his net worth every minute than most Amazon warehouse workers earned in a year. The
Magazine.
Forbes now maintains a global list of billionaires. There are more than 2,000 of them. Their combined wealth exceeds the total wealth of the bottom 50% of humanity. The bottom 50%, 3.5 billion people. This is not normal. Historically speaking, it is not normal. Even in the Gilded Ages of the 19th century, concentrations at this global scale were not possible, because there was no single integrated global economy for wealth to consolidate in. What Piketty gives us is the framework for understanding how this happened, and critically, why it was predictable, even inevitable, absent specific political choices to prevent it. That framework is what we build in Chapter 1, and we will keep building it throughout this series. A quick note on what Piketty is not saying. Before we close this first part, I want to address a misreading that came up repeatedly in the debates after the book was published in English in 2014. Some critics accused Piketty of saying that capitalism is evil, or that rich people are bad, or that growth is impossible under capitalism. He says none of these things. What he says is more nuanced and in some ways more disturbing. He says that capitalism, left to itself, without political intervention, without progressive taxation, without specific redistributive mechanisms, tends toward increasing concentration of wealth. That is a mechanical property of the system, not a moral failing of individuals. He also says that this tendency was interrupted during the 20th century, but the interruption was caused by exceptional and destructive events that we should not wish to repeat. And he says that if we want a different outcome in the 21st century, we need to choose it, deliberately, politically, with the uncomfortable acknowledgement that the choices involve redistributing wealth from those who have it to those who do not. That is not a comfortable argument in any political climate, but it is a precisely argued, data-driven argument, and it deserves to be engaged with seriously. Which is what we are going to do. Coming up in Part 2. In the next part, we dig into the heart of Piketty's analytical framework, the 2 fundamental laws of capitalism, what they say, what they imply, and why they are simultaneously elegant and unsettling. We will talk about the rate of return on capital, the rate of growth of the economy, and the relationship between them. A relationship Piketty writes as R greater than G, which sounds like algebra but functions as a kind of prophecy. Stay with us. Capital in the 21st Century, Chapter 1, Part 2. The Fundamental Laws of Capitalism. Welcome back. In Part 1, we laid the historical groundwork. We talked about the extraordinary inequality of the 19th century, about how the 20th century disrupted it brutally, and about how the 21st century may be reassembling it quietly. Now we go deeper. We go into the engine room. Piketty builds his argument on what he calls fundamental laws of capitalism. I want to walk through both of them carefully, because they are the fulcrum on which his entire analysis rests. And I want to start with a confession about economic laws. Economic laws are not like laws of physics. Water boils at 100 degrees Celsius at sea level, every time, without fail. Economic laws are more like tendencies, forces that operate over long time periods in the absence of countervailing factors. They describe what capitalism does when left to its own devices. They do not say what capitalism must do under any and all conditions. This is an important distinction, because Piketty is not saying the future is determined. He is saying the future is likely, unless we choose otherwise. The first fundamental law, alpha equals R times beta. The first fundamental law is, at its heart, a definition, but a definition with powerful implications. It says this: the share of income from capital in total national income equals the rate of return on capital multiplied by the ratio of capital to income. Written with Greek letters, it looks like alpha equals R times beta. Let us unpack each piece. Alpha is the capital share of income. What fraction of everything produced in the economy goes to owners of capital, as rent, dividends, profits, interest? R is the rate of return on capital. On average, across all forms of capital, how many cents does a dollar of capital earn per year? Beta is the capital to income ratio. How many years of national income does the total stock of capital represent? Now, the arithmetic is simple. If the capital to income ratio is 5 and the average rate of return is 5%, then capital earns 25% of total national income, 1/4 of everything, just from owning stuff. Historically, the rate of return on capital has been remarkably stable, around 4 to 5% per year, across many centuries and many countries. This is one of Piketty's more striking empirical findings. Despite all the upheavals of history, capital has consistently managed to earn roughly 4 to 5% annually over long periods. So if beta rises, if the total stock of capital grows relative to national income, then alpha rises. Capital earns a larger share. And beta has been rising, dramatically, since roughly 1980. Let me make this real. Let me translate this into something you might recognize from daily life. Think about the housing markets of London, Paris, Munich, Sydney, San Francisco. Over the past 40 years, property prices have risen dramatically, not just in nominal terms, in real terms, adjusted for inflation. What does this mean? It means the capital value of housing has grown much faster than national income. The value of the asset has inflated relative to the economy's output. So if you own property in London in 1980, your asset appreciated enormously. Even if you never did a single day's work to improve it, you simply owned it. And if you rent that property, you collect income, which is capital income, and your tenants who also work pay their labor income to you in the form of rent. This is precisely the Piketty dynamic. Labor income flowing toward capital holders, not because the capital holder is more productive, but because the system, at this particular moment in history, rewards ownership over work. Now consider what this has done to an entire generation of young people in these cities. In Munich or in London or in San Francisco, a person starting their career today can work for years, save conscientiously, and still find that property prices rise faster than they can save. The asset moves away from them, not because they are failing, but because capital is compounding faster than labor can accumulate savings. That is not an anecdote. That is the first fundamental law playing out in the housing market, in the lives of millions of people right now. The second fundamental law, beta equals S divided by G. The second fundamental law is where things get really interesting and slightly scary. This law concerns why beta, the capital-to-income ratio, changes over time. And the answer is elegantly simple. In the long run, beta converges on the ratio of the savings rate to the growth rate. Written with symbols, beta equals S over G, where S is the savings rate. What fraction of national income does society save rather than consume? And G is the growth rate. How fast is national income growing per year? Let us think through the logic intuitively. If a society saves a lot and grows slowly, capital accumulates rapidly relative to income. Beta rises, capital becomes more dominant. If a society grows quickly, income rises fast, and the capital stock needs to run hard just to keep pace. Beta stays lower. Now here is the vital historical context. During the long post-war boom of the 1950s and 1960s, Western economies grew at unprecedented rates, 3, 4, sometimes 5% per year in real terms. That high growth kept beta low. Capital did not accumulate too fast because income was rising quickly. But those days ended. The long boom faded in the 1970s, and since then, growth in rich countries has slowed toward 1 or 2% per year. Meanwhile, savings rates have remained positive. Wealthy people save substantial portions of their income, and that savings, invested in capital, keeps compounding. The result, beta rises, capital grows faster than income, capital's share of the pie expands. This is not a policy failure, or not just a policy failure. It is a mathematical consequence of slower growth combined with continued savings. The demographic time bomb hidden in the equation. Here is something Piketty emphasizes that often gets lost in popular summaries. A substantial part of the decline in growth rates is demographic. Economic growth comes from two sources: more people working, and those people becoming more productive. In the post-war era, both factors ran hot. Population grew, women entered the workforce in enormous numbers, education expanded, technological change was rapid. All of this inflated the growth rate. But population growth in rich countries has slowed dramatically. In Germany, in Japan, in most of Southern Europe, the population is actively aging and in some cases declining. The working-age population shrinks. Growth slows accordingly. And Piketty points out something rather counterintuitive. In a world of slow population growth and slow economic growth, inherited wealth becomes more important, not less. Because when there are fewer children per family, the wealth of each preceding generation is divided among fewer heirs. Fortunes concentrate rather than fragment. Think about the contrast between a 19th century French peasant family and a contemporary German professional couple. The peasant family might have had 5 or 6 or 8 children. Whatever wealth existed was divided 8 ways, fragmented, diluted. The contemporary couple has 1 child, perhaps 2. Whatever they accumulate is inherited by 1 person, concentrated, preserved. Add to this the lengthening of lifespans. Grandparents live longer. Wealth transfers happen later. When they do happen, the recipients are already in their 50s or 60s. They are already established professionally. So the inheritance functions not as a way to get started in life, but as a way to become wealthy on top of already being comfortable. This is the subtle machinery that Piketty is exposing, not the obvious villains, not the oligarchs, but the structural dynamics that produce inherited advantage across generations of apparently ordinary middle-class families. Are greater than G the prophecy. And now we arrive at the formula that made Piketty briefly famous, even outside academic economics. R greater than G. R the rate of return on capital. G. The rate of growth of the economy. When the rate of return on capital is consistently higher than the rate of economic growth, wealth tends to concentrate. The rich get richer relative to everyone else, not through any particular effort or villainy, but through the compound arithmetic of the system. Let me give you a very simple illustration. Suppose R is 5% and G is 1%. A person who starts with €1,000,000 of wealth earns €50,000 from that wealth in a year. If they consume only 20,000 and reinvest 30,000, their capital grows by 3%. Meanwhile, the economy grows by 1%. Average wages rise by 1%. The wealthy person's position improves by 3 times the rate at which the average worker's position improves, every year, automatically. Compound this over decades, over generations, and you begin to understand how the concentrations of the 19th century developed, and how they are developing again. Piketty shows that R has historically exceeded G by a considerable margin over most of human history. The brief exception was the mid-20th century, when war, depression, and Reconstruction briefly raised G to exceptional levels while disrupting R through taxation and capital destruction. Now G is low again, and R, while also somewhat lower than its historical average, remains comfortably above G in most rich countries. The engine is running again, on the same tracks. A historical case study, the rentier in the Belle Epoque. Let me put flesh on R greater than G through a historical character that Piketty clearly finds both fascinating and infuriating. The
Rentier.
word comes from the French,
Rente.
meaning a fixed income from capital.
Rentier.
Is a person who lives entirely on the returns from inherited or accumulated wealth. They do not work, they do not produce, they receive. In late 19th and early 20th century France, the
Rentier.
class was the epitome of social aspiration. To be a
Rentier.
was to have achieved the highest possible state of civilized existence, freedom from labor, freedom from the humiliation of employment, the ability to devote one's time to culture, to conversation, to the management of one's affairs. And crucially, the returns were reliable. French government bonds
Les rentes.
paid a stable yield of around 3 to 4%. Private real estate earned more. Stocks were volatile but rewarding over time. A person with £500,000 in capital at 5% would receive 25,000 francs per year. In an era when a skilled worker might earn 1,500 francs per year, this was a princely income, 15 times the wages of a craftsman, without touching the principal. Now, let us think about what it would take to achieve that position through work alone. Even a highly educated professional, a doctor, a lawyer, a senior civil servant, might earn 8 to 10,000 francs per year after decades of training and hard work. To accumulate capital of 500,000 francs through savings alone would require saving a majority of your salary for most of your adult life. Possible in theory. Almost nobody actually did it. The rational strategy, as Vautrin had explained to the young Rastignac, was to marry wealth, not earn it. This is why the Victorian and Edwardian marriage market was simultaneously a romance market and a capital market, and everyone knew it, even if the etiquette required that you never say it quite that baldly. Proust and the Mathematics of Snobbery. Marcel Proust is Piketty's other great literary witness, and
À la recherche du temps perdu.
Proust's vast novel of French society from the Belle Epoque to the aftermath of the First World War is essentially a 6,000-page document of what R greater than G looks like from the inside. Proust's narrator moves through a world where old aristocratic families with ancient names but diminishing capital scramble to ally themselves with new money, where wealthy bourgeois families purchase social respectability through strategic marriages into the nobility, where income from investment is mentioned in the same breath as the quality of a dinner party. And then the war comes, and the world changes, and the old certainties dissolve. Piketty finds Proust fascinating precisely because Proust documented, in novelistic form, the transition, the last flowering of the rentier world before the shocks of the 20th century dismantled it. And the question lurking behind Piketty's entire project is, are we living in a new Belle Epoque? Are we the people who will be described in the novels of 2070 as having lived in an era of extraordinary concentrated wealth that seemed perfectly natural to those inside it? I think it is worth sitting with that question for a moment. Modern examples, the patient investor and the endowment model. Let us bring R greater than G firmly into the present, with an example from institutional finance. The great American universities, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, MIT, manage endowment funds of extraordinary size. Harvard's endowment is currently over $50 billion, Yale's around $40 billion. These endowments earn returns. On average, over the past 2 decades, the Yale endowment under the management of David Swensen earned roughly 13% per year, even in difficult markets. Compare this to the growth rate of the U.S. economy, around 2 to 3% per year in real terms. Yale's endowment, in other words, grew at 4 to 6 times the rate of the broader economy, every year, compounding. Now, Harvard and Yale are not greedy individuals. They are educational institutions. They use these returns to fund scholarships, research, buildings. There is a social purpose. But the mechanism is identical to what Piketty is describing. Large concentrations of capital earn higher returns than the overall economy grows. They compound. They widen the gap between those who have capital and those who do not. And individual billionaires, with access to sophisticated investment strategies and economies of scale in asset management, can replicate this dynamic personally. Warren Buffett has said repeatedly that his fortune grew because he had access to patient capital for a very long time. He started early, earned consistent returns above the market rate, and let compounding do its work over decades. R greater than G Buffett style. The oil states in sovereign wealth, a global dimension. One more modern dimension that Piketty's framework illuminates beautifully. The sovereign wealth funds of oil-producing states, Norway, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait. Norway's sovereign wealth fund, the government pension fund global, holds assets worth more than $1.5 trillion. It owns roughly 1.5% of every publicly listed company in the world. Norway has a population of about 5 million people. Its fund earns returns of around 6 to 7% per year. Norwegian citizens are, in a collective sense, the ultimate model.
Rentier.
Their government owns capital on their behalf. The returns from that capital fund public services, schools, hospitals, pensions. The irony is extraordinary. Norway has built a socialist-flavored welfare state funded by the returns on a gigantic capitalist investment fund. It is simultaneously the most successful application of Piketty's framework and the most elegant escape from its inequalities. Because the capital is collectively owned, the returns benefit everyone, not just the wealthy few. Norway shows that R greater than G does not inevitably produce concentrated inequality. It produces concentrated wealth. What you do with that wealth, how it is owned and distributed, is a political choice. This is the knife's edge on which Piketty stands. He describes a mechanical tendency toward concentration. He does not say it is inevitable. He says we must choose to prevent it. The capital share in practice, what the numbers show. Let me give you some concrete historical data on the capital share. Alpha, the fraction of national income going to capital rather than labor. In France, in Britain, in the United States, the capital share of national income was very high in the 19th century. Somewhere between 35 and 40% of all income went to capital. In the mid-20th century, after the wars and the Great Compression, the capital share fell. In many countries it dropped to 20 to 25%. Labor was capturing a larger share. Then, from roughly 1980, the trend reversed. Capital shares began rising again. In most rich countries, the capital share has increased by several percentage points over the past 4 decades. A shift of 5 percentage points in the capital share might sound small, But on an economy of, say, $20 trillion, 5 percentage points is $1 trillion per year, flowing from workers to capital holders, every year. This is the quiet redistribution that happened alongside the noisier debates about tax rates and social spending. While politicians argued about individual marginal tax rates, the deeper structural shift was moving trillions from labor to capital. And because capital is highly concentrated, this shift moved money from the many to the few. Why did we not notice? Here is a genuinely puzzling question. If this redistribution was happening, why did so few people notice it as it was occurring? Several reasons. First, the data was not readily available. Piketty spent years assembling it from archives. This information was not sitting in a convenient government report. Second, the shift was gradual, slow enough that any given year seemed normal. People compared their situation to last year, not to 1975. Third, and this is perhaps most important, consumer debt masked the stagnation of wages for many households. If your wages are not rising but you can borrow to buy a house, a car, a television, a holiday, the decline in your relative position is less immediately visible. The expansion of consumer credit in the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s effectively allowed working people to maintain a rising standard of living for a generation, even as their share of national income fell. The debt was invisible at the individual level. The structural shift was invisible at the political level. Until 2008, when the debt could not be rolled over any further, and the crisis made visible what the credit had concealed. The financial crisis of 2008, in Piketty's framework, was not primarily a banking crisis. It was the delayed detonation of a structural inequality that had been building for 30 years. Coming up in Part 3. In Part 3, we turn to the historical record in more detail. We look at how wealth has moved across the centuries. We examine the peculiar role of the world wars as, paradoxically, the greatest redistributive events in modern history. We will ask, what does it mean for capital to be destroyed? Who does that destruction help? Who does it hurt? And what are the implications for how we think about inequality today? And we will meet some of the critics who pushed back hard against Piketty in 2014 and 2015, and ask how well their objections have aged. See you in Part 3. Capital in the 21st Century, Chapter 1, Part 3. War, Destruction, and the Great Illusion of Natural Equality. Welcome back to Part 3. We are going to do something a little unusual here. We are going to talk about the two world wars not as political or military events, but as economic events, specifically as redistributive events. Because that is what they were, among other things. And understanding this is essential to understanding why the mid-20th century looked so unusually equal by historical standards, and why we should not mistake that exceptional period for the natural state of capitalism. Fair warning. The story involves some dark mathematics. Capital can be destroyed, obviously, but also subtly. The most obvious way war destroys capital is physical. Bombs fall on factories, artillery demolishes farm buildings, cities burn. Germany in 1945 had approximately 40% of its pre-war capital stock physically destroyed or severely damaged. France had lost enormous amounts of productive capacity. Britain's housing stock, manufacturing facilities, and infrastructure were badly hit. But physical destruction was only one mechanism, and perhaps not the most important one. There was also financial destruction. Inflation erodes the real value of financial assets. Government bonds, bank deposits, insurance policies, all of these lose value when inflation runs high. After both world wars, inflation ran high in most European countries, sometimes very high. The German hyperinflation of 1921 to 1923, during which a wheelbarrow of banknotes would not buy a loaf of bread, wiped out the savings of virtually every middle-class family that had prudently invested in government bonds. And here is the distributional consequence. Who holds financial assets? The wealthy. Who holds wages and physical skills? Workers. inflation redistributes from capital holders to wage earners, not from kindness, from arithmetic. So the inflationary periods of both world wars and their immediate aftermaths functioned, unintentionally, as enormous transfers of wealth from the rich to everyone else. The Second World War and the deliberate choice. After the Second World War, the destruction and redistribution were accompanied, crucially, by deliberate political choice. Democratic governments in Britain, France, the United States, and elsewhere made a conscious decision. This time, we are not going back to the inequality of 1913. This time, we build differently. In Britain, the Attlee government of 1945 created the National Health Service, expanded public housing, nationalized the railways, the coal mines, the steel industry. In France, the nationalization of key industries and the expansion of the social security system transformed the distribution of income. In the United States, the GI Bill gave veterans access to education and mortgages that allowed millions of working-class families to accumulate their first meaningful assets. Progressive income taxation was dramatically expanded. The top marginal rate in the United States reached 91% in the 1950s. In Britain, it was over 90% for decades. These were not empty rates. The wealthy actually paid them sometimes. The result was a society in which capital's share of income was compressed, inheritance was taxed more heavily, and labor income rose faster than capital returns for a sustained period. The Great Compression, the post-war miracle, the Trent Glorieuses, as the French call the 30 glorious years of post-war prosperity. Now here is the intellectual trap. Looking back at this period, it is tempting to conclude, this is what capitalism looks like when it works properly, when it matures, when growth and equality go hand in hand. Piketty says, no, this is what capitalism looks like when it has been subjected to extraordinary, specific, historically contingent interventions. It is not the default state. It is the exception, achieved by extraordinary means. The Kuznets myth, why economists misread the evidence. Let us now deal with the intellectual framework that allowed economists to misread these events for so long. In 1955, the economist Simon Kuznets published a paper based on income distribution data from the United States, England, and Germany. He observed that as these economies had industrialized, inequality had first risen, then fallen. From this observation, he inferred a general principle. All economies, as they develop, follow this inverted U-shaped path. Inequality rises in early industrialization, then falls as growth spreads and workers share in prosperity. This became enormously influential. It was comforting. It told economists and policymakers that they did not need to worry too much about inequality. The market would sort it out. Growth was the solution. It also had a Cold War utility. At a moment when the Soviet Union was arguing that capitalism inevitably produces and worsens inequality, the Kuznets curve offered a counterargument. Look, capitalism solves inequality through growth. No need for revolution. Piketty's critique of Kuznets is devastating but fair. Kuznets was right about the data. Inequality had fallen in those countries between roughly 1920 and 1955, but he got the cause wrong. The fall in inequality was not the natural product of economic maturity. It was the product of two world wars, a Great Depression, and aggressive political intervention. Kuznets was working with data from a very unusual 30-year period and trying to extrapolate a universal historical law from it. That is the kind of mistake that is easy to make when you have limited historical data and considerable political pressure to reach an optimistic conclusion. Piketty, with 2 centuries of data across 20 countries, can see what Kuznets could not. The 20th century compression was the exception. The historical norm is concentration. Let us talk about land. One of the most important and underappreciated aspects of Piketty's capital concept is the inclusion of land. Land is the original form of capital. Before factories, before stock markets, before financial derivatives, there was land. And whoever controlled land controlled everything. In pre-industrial societies, land was the primary form of wealth. In 18th century Britain, the landed aristocracy owned the country, quite literally. Their estates were not merely places to live. They were income-generating machines, rented to tenants, managed for agricultural yield, leased for mineral extraction. The classic model of British inequality before the Industrial Revolution was the landowner and the tenant farmer. The owner provided the land, the farmer provided the labor, and the surplus was divided between them, usually in the landowner's favor. The Industrial Revolution did not abolish this logic. It duplicated it in an industrial context. The factory owner provided the capital, the worker provided the labor, and the profits went primarily to the owner. What changed in the late 19th century was the relative importance of different forms of capital. Agricultural land became less dominant as industry grew, but the fundamental structure, capital earning a return from the labor of others, remained. And today, land is back as a central form of capital, not agricultural land but urban land, the land under London apartments, the land under San Francisco tech offices, the land under Munich townhouses. The extraordinary rise in urban property values over the past 40 years is, in Piketty's framework, the reassertion of land as capital as a major driver of inequality. If you owned a terraced house in Islington in 1980, your land has appreciated by something like 30 to 40 times in real terms by now. You did nothing. The city grew up around you, and you captured that growth as a capital gain. Your tenant, who might have lived in that house for 30 years, paying rent faithfully and contributing to the community and the economy, captured none of that gain. They simply paid more in rent as the years passed. Colonial capital and the forgotten balance sheets. There is another dimension of 19th century capital that Piketty touches on, but that subsequent scholars have developed further: colonial wealth. The great European empires of the 19th century were, among other things, capital extraction machines. Britain, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, all drew enormous returns from colonial enterprises. Plantations worked by enslaved or coerced labor. Mines operated with minimal wages. Monopoly trading companies that extracted raw materials and sold manufactured goods in captive markets. All of this generated returns that flowed back to capital holders in the metropolis. When Piketty measures French or British capital stocks in 1900 and finds them at extraordinary levels relative to national income, we should remember that a significant portion of those capital stocks consisted of colonial assets. Investments in infrastructure, plantations, and extraction industries in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. This matters for two reasons. First, the high returns of the Belle Epoque were partly sustained by colonial exploitation. When we ask why R was so high, part of the answer involves the extraction of value from colonized peoples who received little or nothing in return. Second, decolonization, which accelerated rapidly after the Second World War, was itself a massive destruction of capital from the perspective of European capital holders. Nationalizations in newly independent countries wiped out the value of colonial investments. This is another mechanism, alongside war and inflation, by which European capital stocks were compressed in the mid-20th century. The Great Compression was not only about the welfare state, it was also about the collapse of empire. The critics of 2014 and how they have aged. When Piketty's book appeared in English translation in 2014, it caused something close to an intellectual sensation, and then the backlash arrived. The most serious early critique came from Chris Giles at the Financial Times, who claimed to have found errors in Piketty's data on UK wealth inequality. He suggested the data actually showed wealth concentration was not rising as Piketty claimed. This critique got enormous attention. It felt briefly like the book had been debunked. Piketty responded in detail, and most subsequent scholarship has sided with Piketty. The Financial Times critique involved questionable methodological choices by Giles. The underlying trends Piketty identified have been confirmed by subsequent research from the World Inequality Database and other sources. More interesting was the substantive economic critique, particularly from Larry Summers, the former U.S. Treasury Secretary, who made a sophisticated argument about the relationship between R and G. Summers pointed out that as capital accumulates, the rate of return tends to fall, because additional capital earns less than the initial units. If R falls fast enough as capital grows, the divergence that Piketty fears might self-correct. This is a real theoretical point, and Piketty acknowledges it. His argument is empirical. Historically, the decline in R as beta rises has been slower than the rise in beta, so the divergence has still occurred. Another critique from the right was that Piketty was ignoring the creativity and innovation that wealthy entrepreneurs bring. Bezos, Zuckerberg, Musk, these are not idle.
Rentier.
Clipping coupons, they built things, they created value. This is also a real point, but Piketty's response is equally real. Even if the first generation earns their wealth through genuine innovation, the second and third generations inherit it. And inheritance is not innovation. The children of Elon Musk will not inherit his genius. They will inherit his wealth. And then R greater than G will work for them, silently and reliably, just as it worked for the heirs of the great industrial fortunes of the 19th century. A digression on the inheritance of mediocrity. I want to dwell on this point because I think it is underappreciated. We live in a society that tells a story about itself as a meritocracy. The best people rise, the most talented succeed, hard work and intelligence are rewarded. This story contains some truth. There is more social mobility than there was in the feudal era. There are genuinely talented people from modest backgrounds who have risen to positions of prominence. But there is a hidden assumption in the meritocracy story. It assumes that the people at the top are there primarily because of merit, and it assumes that inherited advantage merely gives people a head start in an otherwise fair race. Piketty's data suggests something more unsettling. When capital's return is high relative to growth, the advantage conferred by inheritance is not a head start. It is a different race altogether. The person who inherits 10 million euros at age 30 does not merely have an advantage in the competition for income. They are not competing for income at all. They live on capital returns, 400,000 or 500,000 euros per year, before doing a single thing. Meanwhile, their highly educated, talented, hardworking peer who received no inheritance works for 30 years to accumulate, if things go very well, 1 million or 2 million euros. The inherited advantage is not a head start. It is a categorically different position in the economic structure. And the moral legitimacy of that difference is, Piketty insists, a political question that democratic societies need to confront honestly. Germany and the peculiar case of business capital. Let me bring in a case study that is particularly relevant for those of us in the German-speaking world. Germany is unusual among rich countries in several ways that relate directly to Piketty's framework. First, Germany has a high savings rate. German households save a relatively large fraction of their income. This tends, per the second fundamental law, to push up beta. Second, German manufacturing companies, particularly the famous
Mittelstand
firms, are often family-owned across multiple generations. They represent a form of capital accumulation and inheritance that operates somewhat outside the financial markets. Third, Germany has relatively low home ownership rates compared to Britain or Spain. Germans rent more. This has interesting distributional consequences. When property prices rise, the gains accrue more narrowly to the landlord class. The result is that Germany has a rather unusual distribution of capital. High overall capital stocks, but highly concentrated among a relatively narrow class of business-owning families and large property holders. Germany's Gini coefficient for income, which measures inequality, looks modest by international standards, but Germany's Gini coefficient for wealth is actually quite high, among the highest in Europe. Income is relatively equal in Germany. Wealth is concentrated. This is exactly the pattern Piketty's framework would predict. Labor income is compressed by strong unions and codetermination, but capital has been accumulating for decades, and capital is held by a small fraction of families. Coming up in Part 4. In Part 4, we turn to the big political question: what, if anything, can be done? Piketty's answer is radical but carefully argued: a global progressive wealth tax. We will examine what this would actually mean, why he describes it with engaging self-awareness as a utopian idea, and what alternatives have been proposed. We will also look at what has happened to inequality in the decades since the book was published. Has Piketty's forecast held up? Are the trends he described still running? And what do the politics of the 2020s tell us about our capacity to respond? Part 4 coming right up. Capital in the 21st Century, Chapter 1, Part 4. What can be done? The politics of the impossible. Welcome to Part 4. We have now established the historical record. We have understood the fundamental laws. We have seen how R greater than G produces concentration, and how the 20th century's exceptional disruptions temporarily reversed this tendency. Now comes the question that every reader and every reviewer has been waiting for. So what do we do about it? And this is where Piketty, the careful empiricist, becomes Piketty, the cautious radical, and where the book generated the most controversy. The proposal: a global progressive wealth tax. Piketty's headline policy proposal is a global progressive tax on capital wealth, not income, wealth, on the total stock of assets a person holds. The structure he proposes is something like this: zero tax on wealth below 1 million euros, a modest rate, perhaps 1%, on wealth between 1 million and 5 million, a higher rate, perhaps 2%, on wealth above 5 million, and potentially even higher rates on very large fortunes above 1 billion. Now, a wealth tax of 2% sounds modest, but on a fortune of 100 million euros, that is 2 million euros per year, every year, from the principal. And if the rate of return on that fortune is, say, 5%, the owner earns 5 million euros per year. The tax takes 2 million. They keep 3 million. Their wealth still grows, just more slowly. The crucial word in Piketty's proposal is global, because he fully acknowledges that a wealth tax imposed by one country alone simply encourages wealthy people to move their assets offshore, to Luxembourg, to Switzerland, to the Cayman Islands. For the tax to work, it must be international. Every country must report wealth held by residents to every other country. Capital must have nowhere to hide. And this is why Piketty, with characteristic dry wit, calls it a utopian idea. Not because it is economically unworkable, but because the political coordination required is, for now, almost unimaginable. Rich people fund politicians. Politicians set tax policy. And rich people who can afford to move their assets internationally have strong incentives to ensure that no such coordination ever happens. Why he proposes it anyway? If the policy is utopian, why does Piketty propose it? For two reasons. First, as a benchmark, to show what a logically consistent response to the problem would look like. Even if we cannot achieve it fully, we can move in the direction of it. And knowing the destination helps us evaluate partial steps. Second, because utopia has a history of becoming policy. In 1900, votes for women were utopian. In 1920, an 8-hour working day was utopian. In 1945, universal health care was utopian to many. Political possibilities change. Crises create openings. The question is whether we will have thought through the alternatives carefully enough to seize those openings when they come. Piketty wants to have done the thinking in advance, so that when the political moment arrives, the intellectual infrastructure is ready. What has actually been tried, and what has worked? Let us leave utopia for a moment and look at what has actually been tried, and what the evidence shows. Several European countries have had wealth taxes at various points. Sweden, Norway, the Netherlands, Germany, Switzerland, France. Some still do, in modified form. The results have been mixed, and the critics are not entirely wrong about the problems. France introduced the
Impôt de solidarité sur la fortune.
ISF, a wealth tax on net assets above a certain threshold. It was abolished by Emmanuel Macron in 2017 and replaced with a narrower tax on real estate only. Macron argued the ISF was driving wealthy French individuals to relocate to Belgium, to London, to Switzerland. And there is evidence this was happening. Some high-profile French billionaires did indeed take up residence abroad. But here is the complication. How much of the capital flight was genuinely a response to the wealth tax versus other factors? Tax avoidance is not new. The wealthy were avoiding French taxes before the ISF, and they continue to do so after it. The Swedish experience is instructive. Sweden abolished its wealth tax in 2007. The stated reason was capital flight. The actual outcome was more complex. Inequality in Sweden has risen since the abolition, though Sweden still has much lower inequality than the United States or Britain. Norway has retained its wealth tax, and Norway is, by any measure, not experiencing the catastrophic capital exodus its opponents predicted. The lesson seems to be, a wealth tax works better when combined with strong international information exchange agreements. When capital cannot easily hide, the tax is more effective and the flight is more limited. The global minimum tax, a small step in the right direction. In 2021, something happened that Piketty might have described in 2013 as unlikely to occur in his lifetime. The OECD countries and the G20 agreed on a global minimum corporate tax rate of 15%. For the first time, there was genuine international coordination on preventing corporate tax avoidance. This is not a wealth tax. It is a corporate tax, and 15% is quite modest, but it represents a proof of concept. The impossible coordination problem that Piketty identified was, at least partially, solved. Countries like Ireland, which had built their entire economic model on being a tax haven for U.S. multinational companies, were forced to raise their corporate tax rate. This is small, but it is not nothing, and it demonstrates that international tax coordination, which critics insisted was a fantasy, can actually be achieved when political will exists. The question Piketty would ask is, what would it take to extend this principle from corporate tax to individual wealth? And the answer involves confronting the political economy of wealth directly. The political economy of inequality, who benefits from doing nothing. There is a reason the policy responses to rising inequality have been so limited, and it is not primarily intellectual. It is not that politicians do not understand the problem. It is that the people who benefit from the status quo are also the people who have the most influence over the political process. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a straightforward application of standard political science. Political systems in democracies are not perfectly representative. They are biased toward organized, resourced interests. Wealthy individuals and corporations have resources to fund political campaigns, lobbying operations, think tanks, media organizations, and legal challenges. They use these resources rationally to protect their interests. When Piketty talks about the political sustainability of high inequality, he is raising a question that goes beyond economics. Can democracy function effectively when economic power is sufficiently concentrated? The American political theorist Larry Bartels showed, in research published just before Piketty's book, that U.S. senators' policy positions on economic issues were strongly correlated with the preferences of wealthy constituents and almost entirely uncorrelated with the preferences of low-income constituents. The preferences of the poor, in terms of economic policy, essentially did not register in Senate votes. The preferences of the rich almost always did. This is not democracy as the civics textbooks describe it. This is what happens when economic and political power become too closely aligned. Piketty does not develop this argument at length in Capital, but it is clearly part of his worry. High economic inequality tends to produce high political inequality, and high political inequality undermines the capacity to address economic inequality. It is a self-reinforcing dynamic, which is one reason he is more than usually pessimistic about the prospects for reform within the current system. The comparison that stings, America and Europe. Let us make a comparison that Piketty draws out carefully, and that continues to be illuminating a decade later. The United States and Europe started from roughly similar levels of inequality in the mid-20th century. The Great Compression happened on both sides of the Atlantic. Since 1980, they have diverged dramatically. In the United States, the share of income going to the top 1% doubled, from roughly 9% in 1980 to around 20% by 2010. The top 10% increased their share dramatically as well. In continental Europe, the increase was much more modest. France, Germany, Sweden all saw inequality rise from their post-war lows, but nothing approaching the American trajectory. What accounts for the difference? Not primarily economic forces. The same forces of globalization and technological change operated in both contexts. The difference is political, policy choices. The United States dramatically cut marginal tax rates in the 1980s under Reagan. It weakened labor unions through policy and through economic restructuring. It deregulated financial markets. It weakened the federal minimum wage in real terms. Europe did some of these things too, but less dramatically. Labor protections remained stronger. Progressive taxation was maintained at higher levels. Social spending did not shrink as sharply. The result: two developed regions, similar economic structures, dramatically different inequality outcomes, because they made different political choices. This is perhaps the most important empirical argument in Piketty's entire book. Inequality is not primarily the product of impersonal economic forces. It is the product of policy, and policy can be changed. The inheritance tax debate, a case study in political difficulty. Let me take one policy instrument as a case study in the political difficulties of addressing wealth concentration. Inheritance taxes, taxes on wealth transferred between generations. Economically, inheritance taxes are one of the most efficient and least distortionary ways to address wealth concentration. They are levied on a transfer that the recipient did not earn. They fall at a moment of intergenerational transition, when wealth can be redistributed with minimal disruption to the productive use of capital. And yet inheritance taxes are among the most politically unpopular taxes that exist. In the United States, the estate tax applies to very few households, perhaps fewer than 2,000 estates per year, and yet it generates intense political opposition. The opposition has been cultivated skillfully. The estate tax has been rebranded as the death tax. It has been framed as a threat to family farms and small businesses, even though the exemptions mean these are almost never actually affected. And it has been framed as an attack on what families have earned and wish to pass on to their children. This framing taps into deep instincts about family, about providing for one's children, about the fruits of one's own labor. Piketty's response is that these instincts, while understandable, are being exploited to protect something quite different from what most people imagine. Not the farmer passing her land to her son, but the heir to a $300 million fortune who will never need to work a day in their life, not because of their own labor or creativity, but because of the accident of birth. These are not the same thing, but the political framing deliberately conflates them. The automation question, a new dimension Piketty did not fully address. Here is a development that Piketty touched on, but that has become considerably more urgent since 2013. Automation and artificial intelligence. If the fundamental tension in Piketty's framework is between capital and labor, what happens when capital increasingly replaces labor altogether? In the 19th century, machinery threatened certain categories of skilled craftsmen. The Luddites famously smashed looms in English textile mills, not out of irrationality, but out of accurate understanding that their skills were being devalued. But the 19th century ultimately created more jobs than it destroyed. through the expansion of new industries and the growth of the service sector. The question for the 21st century is whether artificial intelligence follows the same pattern, or whether, for the first time, the productivity of capital genuinely substitutes for, rather than complements, human labor across a wide range of tasks. If artificial intelligence and robotics allow the owners of capital to produce more output with fewer workers, the capital share of income rises further. Labor's bargaining power diminishes. Wages are compressed. The Piketty dynamic accelerates. R rises relative to wages. G in labor terms may not rise much even if output does, and the benefits of technological progress accrue primarily to the owners of the technology. This is not inevitable, but it is the direction of travel if no deliberate policy choices are made to distribute the gains from automation. And the current trajectory of AI development is, frankly, not encouraging from this perspective. The companies developing the most powerful AI systems are privately held or publicly listed, which means their productivity gains flow to shareholders, not to the broader workforce whose jobs they may displace. The wealth of nations versus the nation's wealth. Let me close part 4 with a philosophical point that I think deserves more attention than it usually gets. When we talk about a country's wealth, we often confuse two very different things. There is the productive capacity of the economy, the ability to make things, provide services, innovate, create. And there is the distribution of claims on that productive capacity. Who owns the factories, the land, the financial assets? A country can be extremely productive while its wealth is very concentrated. Silicon Valley produces enormous economic value, but the distribution of that value is extraordinarily unequal. Alternatively, a country can have modest productivity but relatively equal distribution. The difference between average and median incomes can be small, meaning most people get close to the average, because wealth is not concentrated at the top. GDP, the standard measure of economic performance, captures the first, the amount produced. It tells you almost nothing about the second, who receives the proceeds. Piketty argues, and has been arguing more forcefully in his subsequent work, that we need to radically reform how we measure economic performance. We need to track distribution, not just total output. A society that is growing at 3% per year, but where all the growth goes to the top 1% is, by almost any humane standard, performing worse than a society that is growing at 2%, but where everyone shares proportionately. But our current metrics and the political conversations they drive focus relentlessly on aggregate growth, not on distribution. Change the metrics, Piketty suggests, and you change the politics. When people can see clearly that growth is not reaching them, they may be more willing to support policies that address the distribution problem. Coming up in Part 5. Part 5 is our final chapter. We bring everything together. We will ask, has Piketty been right? What has happened to inequality since the book was published? How does his framework illuminate the political upheavals of the 2010s and 2020s, the rise of populism, Brexit, Trump, the Gilets jaunes in France, the global wave of discontent? And we will ask the big question, does Piketty offer us hope, or is he simply the most rigorously documented prophet of a fate we cannot escape? Part 5, the conclusion and the verdict. Capital in the 21st Century, Chapter 1, Part 5. The verdict, did Piketty get it right? Welcome to the final part. We have now covered a considerable amount of ground. We have understood the fundamental laws. We have traced the historical pattern from the Belle Epoque through the Great Compression and back. We have examined the policy debate. Now let us ask the hardest question. 10 years on from the publication of Capital in the 21st century, does the framework hold up? Has history been kind to Piketty's analysis, or have his critics been vindicated? The short answer, the empirical trends he identified have continued, and in some cases accelerated. The political responses have been largely inadequate, and the world of 2025 looks considerably more Piketty-ish than optimists hoped. The numbers since 2013. The World Inequality Database, which Piketty helped create and which continues to publish updated data, tells us the following. Global wealth concentration has increased since 2013. The share of wealth held by the top 1% globally rose from roughly 45% in 2013 to above 47% by the early 2020s. The pandemic of 2020 and 2021 dramatically accelerated this trend in the short term. As stock markets recovered quickly while working-class jobs collapsed, the wealth of billionaires rose by extraordinary amounts. Forbes reported that global billionaire wealth increased by $5 trillion in 2021 alone. The recovery from the pandemic recession was distributional, almost the mirror image of the Great Compression. Rather than capital being compressed and labor strengthened, capital recovered first and most completely. Wages did rise in some sectors, particularly for low-wage workers in the United States, as tight labor markets gave workers unusual bargaining power in 2021 and 2022. This was a genuine positive development, but it was partially reversed by inflation, which eroded the real value of those wage gains. The overall picture, Piketty's direction of travel, has been confirmed. The pace has been, if anything, faster than he anticipated. The political eruption that nobody predicted, but Piketty understood. In 2016, two events shocked the political establishments of the Western world: Brexit and the election of Donald Trump. These events were analyzed endlessly through cultural, political, and psychological lenses: immigration, identity, media, personality, tribalism. All of these analyses had merit, but Piketty's framework adds something they often missed: the economic substrate beneath the cultural eruption. The voters who most strongly supported Brexit in England were concentrated in post-industrial towns and regions that had experienced decades of relative economic decline. The voters who most strongly supported Trump were in areas that had been devastated by deindustrialization and the collapse of manufacturing employment. These were not, primarily, wealthy people resentful of redistribution. They were working-class and lower-middle-class people who felt, accurately in many cases, that the economic system was not working for them. That growth, when it occurred, was not reaching them. That their children would be poorer than they were. This is the political economy of inequality in action. When the distribution of economic gains becomes sufficiently skewed, and when the mainstream political parties of both left and right fail to address it, people look elsewhere. For answers, for someone to blame, for something that feels like change. Piketty has written about this explicitly in his subsequent work. He argues that rising inequality has been a key driver of the political crisis of Western democracies, not the only driver, but a fundamental one. And he notes with considerable irony that the populist politicians who have benefited from this crisis have generally, once in office, pursued policies that increase rather than decrease inequality. Tax cuts for the wealthy, deregulation, weakening of labor protections. The people who voted for radical change, frustrated with a system that was not serving them, often ended up with policies that served them even less, while making some of them feel better in cultural and identity terms. Pause 600 ms. This is one of the more depressing observations that Piketty's framework generates, and it is, unfortunately, well supported by the evidence.
Les gilets jaunes.
And the complexity of inequality politics. Let me spend a moment on a French case study that Piketty found particularly painful to watch. In 2018 and 2019, France was convulsed by the
Gilets jaunes.
movement, the yellow vests, named after the high-visibility safety jackets that French motorists are required to carry in their cars. The movement began as a protest against a fuel tax increase. Emmanuel Macron's government had raised fuel taxes as part of a carbon pricing scheme. The increase hit rural and peri-urban workers hard, people who commuted long distances by car to reach employment, people who had no practical alternative to driving. Here is the bitter irony. Macron's carbon tax was, in principle, a progressive environmental policy. Taxing carbon is economically sensible. But the incidence of the tax was deeply regressive. It fell most heavily on working people in rural areas who needed to drive, not on wealthy urban professionals who could cycle, take public transport, or afford electric vehicles. Meanwhile, in the same period, Macron had abolished the wealth tax on financial assets, the ISF, in his first year in office. The move benefited wealthy investors. It cost the state several billion euros per year. The distributional message was catastrophic. The poor pay more, the rich pay less. Even if neither policy was designed with that intention, the effect was unmistakable. The
Gilets jaunes.
were not an irrational movement. They were people responding, messily and angrily, to exactly the kind of distributional injustice that Piketty's framework describes. And Piketty, who was interviewed repeatedly during the crisis, said essentially, "You designed a carbon tax without attending to its distributional consequences, and you abolished a wealth tax at the same time. What did you expect?" The climate crisis in Piketty, a convergence. The
Gilets jaunes.
crisis points to something even larger, the intersection of inequality and the climate crisis. Addressing climate change requires massive economic transformation, phasing out fossil fuels, rebuilding energy infrastructure, changing transport systems, redesigning agriculture. All of this costs money, and the question of who pays is fundamentally a question about distribution. The wealthy have contributed disproportionately to carbon emissions. The top 10% of income earners account for roughly 50% of global greenhouse gas emissions, once you include the emissions embedded in the goods and services they consume. The bottom 50% of the global population accounts for roughly 10% of emissions, but they will bear the heaviest burden of climate impacts because they live in more vulnerable regions, because they have fewer resources to adapt, because they cannot afford to move. Any credible climate policy that does not address this distributional injustice will face the
Gilets jaunes.
problem at global scale, popular resistance from people who are asked to bear costs they did not primarily generate. Piketty has increasingly emphasized this connection. His 2019 book
Capital et idéologie.
devotes substantial attention to it. Progressive wealth taxation and carbon pricing can be designed to work together. Tax wealth to redistribute to the green transition. Tax carbon but use the revenue to compensate those who cannot afford the transition. It is, again, a utopian proposal in the current political context. And it is, again, one that becomes less utopian the more the climate crisis worsens. China, the elephant in Piketty's room. We cannot close this series without addressing the largest economic story of the past 40 years, China. China's economic growth since 1980 has been, by most measures, the most dramatic and sustained reduction in poverty in human history. Hundreds of millions of people lifted out of destitution. A rural economy transformed into an industrial and technological powerhouse. How does this fit with Piketty's framework? In one sense, it challenges it. The period of rapid growth did distribute broadly in China, at least in the early decades. The Kuznets pattern, which Piketty dismisses for mature economies, may have some validity for countries at China's stage of development in the 1980s. But as China has matured, inequality has risen sharply. China's Gini coefficient increased dramatically from the 1980s to the 2000s. The gap between coastal cities and rural hinterland became extreme. The gap between the emerging billionaire class and the average worker became extreme. And now, as China's growth rate slows from double digits to something more like 5 or 6%, and as the country ages demographically, the Piketty dynamics are kicking in. Capital is accumulating, inequality is embedded, and the political system, unlike in Western democracies, does not have institutional channels through which popular pressure for redistribution can operate. Xi Jinping's crackdowns on technology billionaires in 2021 and 2022, on Alibaba, on Didi, on the education sector, were partly about political control. But they were also, at some level, a recognition that conspicuous concentrated wealth was becoming a political liability. a state attempting to address Piketty-style concentration by arbitrary regulatory intervention rather than systematic taxation and redistribution. Effective in the short term, sustainable less certain. The supermanagers, a complication Piketty grapples with. Let me address one genuinely complex aspect of modern inequality that Piketty himself finds somewhat puzzling. The explosion of very high wages for top executives, what he calls the supermanagers. In the 19th century, inequality was primarily driven by capital income. The rich were rich because they owned land, businesses, financial assets. Their labor income was not particularly spectacular. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, a new phenomenon emerged. Very high labor income for a small class of senior corporate executives, fund managers, bankers, and certain professionals. A CEO of a large American company might earn $50 to $100 million per year. This is labor income in the technical sense. A salary, a bonus, stock options that vest with continued employment. But it is labor income so large that it allows rapid capital accumulation. The CEO saves part of the extraordinary salary, invests it, and within a generation transitions from very high labor income to very high capital income. The supermanagers complicate the clean capital versus labor story. In the short run, their fortunes are built on wages, but wages so large that they function like capital income. Piketty's explanation for this phenomenon is somewhat tentative, and it has attracted criticism. He suggests that the rise of supermanager pay is partly a product of weaker social norms around executive pay, and partly of weakened institutional constraints such as unions and high marginal tax rates. When top marginal tax rates were 90%, there was little point in a board paying an executive $100 million. Most of it would go to the state. When top rates are 40%, a $100 million salary is much more attractive for both parties. There is something to this, but the full explanation for the explosion of executive pay is genuinely complex. Corporate governance failures, the principal agent problem, the self-serving nature of compensation committees, the financialization of corporate culture, all of these play a role. The important point for our purposes is this. Whether the supermanager fortune started as labor income or capital income, after one generation it is capital, and then R greater than G takes over. Piketty's intellectual honesty, what he gets wrong. I want to spend a few minutes being fair to Piketty's critics, because a serious engagement with his work requires acknowledging its limitations. First, his treatment of the rate of return on capital is sometimes too uniform. He writes as if R is a single, stable number across all forms of capital, but in reality, the return on capital varies enormously. Cash earns almost nothing. A startup venture earns potentially enormous returns or loses everything. Small businesses earn very different returns from hedge funds. The average return of 4 to 5% is real, but the distribution of returns is extremely wide. And who you are, how connected you are, how much capital you have to deploy determines enormously what return you actually get. Second, Piketty's framework is primarily about the developed world. His data, though extensive, is mostly from Western Europe and North America. The dynamics in sub-Saharan Africa, in South Asia, in Latin America may be importantly different. Third, his policy proposals are better at identifying the direction of reform than at specifying the mechanism. A global wealth tax is a beautiful idea that runs into ferocious practical difficulties beyond the coordination problem. How do you value private businesses? Who assesses the worth of a closely held family firm? How do you handle illiquid assets? These are not fatal objections, but they are real, and the details of implementation matter enormously for whether a wealth tax achieves its distributional goals without excessive economic distortion. The book as a political act. Here is something about capital in the 21st century that is easy to miss when you focus on the data and the theory. It is a political act, a deliberate, carefully executed political act by a serious economist. Piketty decided, quite deliberately, to write a book about inequality using the language and tools of academic economics, but aimed at a general audience, with the explicit goal of changing the political conversation. This is not the usual mode of academic economics. Academic economists write for each other, in journals full of mathematics, for audiences of several hundred specialists. Piketty wanted to write for everyone. He wanted inequality to be the kind of thing that educated people could discuss with data, not just with emotion or ideology. And in this ambition he succeeded remarkably. The book sold millions of copies, in dozens of languages. It changed what politicians felt they needed to address. It created a vocabulary, R greater than G,
Rentier.
the supermanager, that entered mainstream political discourse. Whether it changed actual policy is more debatable. The changes have been modest relative to the scale of the problem Piketty identified. But the conversation is different, and changing the conversation is the first step. What would Piketty say about today? Let us end with a thought experiment. It is 2025. Piketty looks at the world. What does he see? He sees global billionaire wealth at record levels. The world's roughly 2,500 billionaires collectively hold more wealth than the bottom 60% of humanity. He sees AI development concentrating enormous productive capacity in the hands of a small number of companies and investors. NVIDIA's market capitalization reached $3 trillion. A company that did not exist in its current form 20 years ago now represents one of the largest capital stocks in history. He sees Western democracies struggling with political polarization, partly driven by the distributional failures he described. Mainstream parties of both left and right failing to address the underlying economic anxieties. He sees climate change requiring enormous redistribution, globally, but the political coalitions to achieve it remaining unstable. He sees international tax coordination making tentative progress on corporate tax, while personal wealth taxation remains almost entirely absent from the agenda. And he sees demographic trends continuing to compress growth rates in rich countries, while savings rates remain high, pushing beta upward year after year. He would say, the trends I identified in 2013 are intact, the dynamics are running, the political responses remain insufficient, the window for intervention is open but narrowing. This is not a cheerful verdict, but Piketty has never claimed to be a cheerful analyst. He has claimed to be an honest one. What do we take away from Chapter 1? Let me summarize what Chapter 1 of Capital in the 21st Century has given us. First, a vocabulary: income, capital, the capital-to-income ratio, the capital share, the rate of return, the rate of growth. These are the tools we need to think clearly about inequality. Second, a historical framework. The long run of history shows capital concentrating. The 20th century was the great exception, caused by exceptional and destructive events. The 21st century is reverting toward the historical norm. Third, a mechanical understanding. The two fundamental laws, the relationship between savings, growth, and capital accumulation. The logic of R greater than G. These are not opinions. They are descriptions of how the arithmetic of capitalism works. Fourth, a political argument. The current trajectory is not inevitable. It is the product of policy choices or the absence of them. Different choices would produce different outcomes, but those choices require confronting powerful interests. Fifth, a moral challenge. What kind of society do we want? One where birth determines economic fate as in the 19th century, or one where work, talent, and creativity matter more than accident of birth? That is a choice, and it is one that each generation has to make or default into not making. A final word from Piketty himself. Piketty ends Chapter 1 with something that is not common in economics textbooks. He expresses a value. He says, essentially, democracy and markets are not enemies, but markets, left to themselves, produce outcomes that are not compatible with democratic ideals of equal citizenship. When wealth is sufficiently concentrated, The wealthy have too much political power and everyone else too little. He does not call for the abolition of capitalism. He calls for its domestication, for the same process of political taming that produced labor laws, environmental regulations, antitrust policy, but now applied to the concentration of wealth. Whether you agree with his policy prescriptions or not, this framing seems to me exactly right. The question of distribution is not a technical question with a technical answer. It is a political question about what we want our societies to be. It requires democratic deliberation, informed by data but not determined by data. And that deliberation requires the kind of clear-headed historical analysis that Piketty has provided. Which is why, a decade after publication, this remains the most important economics book of the 21st century so far, not because it has all the answers, but because it asks, with unprecedented rigor, the questions that most matter. Thank you for joining us for Chapter 1 of Capital in the 21st Century by Thomas Piketty. In our next series, we continue with Chapter 2, where Piketty turns to the concept of growth itself, what drives it, how it has changed over the sweep of history, and what the future of economic growth looks like in a world of aging populations, slowing productivity, and ecological limits. The story is far from over.